Hello everyone, my name is Andrew. Today we continue learning Python, and today we'll talk about constructors and destructors in Python object-oriented programming. So let's start. Once again, today we'll talk about constructors, so constructor, and destructor for object-oriented programming in Python. So a lot of you liked my videos on object-oriented programming, on classes and objects in Python, and that is why I'm thinking of making a full course on YouTube. So lots of videos are already on YouTube that are related to classes and objects, even on my channel, but still I'm making that course. So today I'll talk about constructors and destructors, and if you have not seen the last video, then I think you should watch it, because I'll not explain all of the stuff, why we need classes, what are objects, and so on. So a small recap is that we have class human, we can create variables for that class, we can create functions for the class, for example, make something, and almost every function has self-parameter. And self-parameter is the parameter, or is an object that called that specific function. So we can create our classes using parentheses, and we can assign objects to those classes. After that, we can use those methods and those variables of our classes using dot notation, so human.x and human.make. And yeah, that's kind of the whole idea. We can pass other arguments aside from self, for example, return x plus y, and we don't need to put self inside of our make, because self is the object that we are calling our function from. So 1, 2. Yeah, the last video was kind of long, but I explained it in like 30 seconds, but whatever. Okay, now we'll talk about constructors and destructors. So let me once again create my class human, and that class human can have, for example, 4 variables: ID, name, surname, and balance. So imagine that we are building our banking system, and we have humans, we have our customers. Yeah, let me just remove it or replace it as a customer, because human is kind of strange, but whatever. We have 4 variables, and whenever we want to create our object customer, we need to assign those 4 variables. So all of the fields are required for our system. But what is the problem? We have 2 problems. First of all, we cannot make all of our users like assign those variables, because we can simply create a customer and now our values are not assigned. So those values are default. We have ID 0, name as an empty string, and that is not good. And second of all, if we want to assign those variables, we need to write like 4 lines of code. So customer balance equals, for example, 10, customer name equals something, ID equals something, and so on. That is not pretty at all. And that is why we can use constructors. So in Python and in every programming language, I'll show you another example in a minute, we have constructors. So what is a constructor? Constructor is a function that is being called whenever you create an object from a class. So as you can see here, and as you know, we create our objects using parentheses. So we give the name of the class with parentheses. And those parentheses is the function which is a constructor. So in our case, init is a constructor. So init is a constructor. But a lot of videos on YouTube say that, but none of them says, well, maybe some of them say that actually init is not a constructor. So once again, the definition of constructor in object-oriented programming is that constructor is a function that is being called whenever we create an object. So this function allocates the memory for our variables, allocates the memory for our functions, methods, and all of that stuff. But in Python, actually, we have not 1 constructor, but 2. So we have init, and we also have new. So new function is the function that is really it really creates an object. So new function, as you can see, we don't have self because there is no object yet, but in init we have self. Because the difference is that new is a constructor, like a real constructor as we have it in other programming languages. But init is a function that just initializes our variables. That is why it's called init, not construct or constructor. So constructor in Python is equal to initializer. So actually init is an initializer, and we call it constructor because not lots of classes use new. So once again, the idea is that new is a function that creates an object. but init is a function that assigns all of the variables and executes all of the code that we need to execute once our object is created. So if you're talking about the real constructor, then it's new. But if you're talking about the initializer, it's init. But in Python, we don't often use new. We use it, but for some specific cases. And because of that, init, it's often called constructor, and I'm going to call it constructor as well. But actually, the academic name is initializer. Okay, so that is the whole idea. And why do we need init? Because whenever we create our object, we can run some code. For example, customer was created. I use init function and print customer was created whenever I create my object. So if I would create like 5 customers, let me run my code. As you can see, I can see 5 messages that customer was created. And we can run any code that we want. For example, we can use customer count, and then append that or increase that customer count every time we create our customer. So customer count, yeah, we need to use global customer count. And let me just print customer count. Let me run it. As you can see, we have 5 customers, so 5 at the end. And yeah, that is very, very powerful, because aside from just calling some code, what we can do is put variables inside of our init. So as I said before, what if we have a system where we need to really make our variables required once? So for example, now we have our ID, name, surname, and balance in our class. And if we want to make our variables once again or mark them as required, then what we can do is simply provide those variables inside of our class, or inside of our constructor, sorry. So now what is the problem? The problem is that if I just call my customer with parentheses without any parameters in them, then what does it mean? That means that I miss 4 positional arguments. So constructor is a specific magic function. So yeah, those functions are called magic functions. And by the way, you should always, you cannot like make it constructor, like that constructor. The name init is very, very important, because with that name, Python understands that init is really the constructor. So the name is important. I have a video about operators overriding, so it's kind of related to that. But yeah, if you want to make a constructor, always call it init. That is the rule. And I will talk about why I think in 5 videos if I continue making that course. Okay, so now what is the problem? The problem is that we miss 4 variables. We miss 4 arguments in our function. And that is just, imagine that is just a normal Python function. So if you miss 4 arguments, then you have an error. And that is why we can make our customers provide all of the values in our classes, in our objects. So now what we can do here is just simply assign self ID as ID, self name as name, self surname as surname, and self balance as balance. So as you can see, our code is, yeah, it's kind of simple, but what we are doing here is we're saying for that specific object, its ID is going to be ID, which our user provided. So let me just quickly put it there. ID, name, hello, surname, ABC, and balance, 10, for example. And also you can run any validations that you want inside of your init. We'll talk about that later when we will talk about design problems and design solutions with object-oriented programming. But yeah, you can run any validators for your functions. So for example, validate that balance is an integer, ID is bigger than 0 or is unique, and so on. So as you can see right now, we have balance as 10. So I just put it there. I put balance as 10 in my constructor and I receive 10 at the end. So that is very, very simple. But aside from constructor, of course, we can call any code that we want. We can call self any function that we want. But aside from constructor, we also have destructor. So as you can see here, constructor and destructor. So what is the difference between those two? The difference is, I think you already know it, is that constructor is being called when we create our object, but destructor is being called when we delete our object. So in our case, I just write object was deleted. And in order to do that, in order to see that message, I need to use delete from my customer. Let me run it. As you can see, object was deleted. So that is the whole idea of constructor, or sorry, destructor. So once again, delete is a destructor. But I want to point out that in other languages, constructors and destructors are very, very important. But in Python, with 99% of the classes, you just write init, which is an initializer, so you already have all of the code. And delete is kind of, it's not useless, but it's very, very rare to see. Why is that? Because in other languages, when we are talking about any variable, well, in some languages, in some low-level languages, like for example C++, when we are talking about constructor and destructor, those functions are really the heart of our object. So the heart of our class, object-oriented programming, and so on. Because constructor allocates the memory for our variables. And why I said that we will not often see that in Python, I didn't say that, but yeah, we will not often see that in Python because allocation of the memory, so all of that stuff is being called in U. So U is the function that is responsible for that. Aside from just that, Python allocates and deallocates all the memory automatically. So that is why we don't need to care about that. But U is a real constructor. So if you want to work with other languages, then you should always understand that constructor and destructor are very, very important. But in Python, those are just, they're great, they're important. I do not say that they are like not important, unimportant, or they are not useful. But what I'm saying is that in Python, when you're talking about init and delete, so constructor and destructor, or once again, initializer and destructor, you're talking about simple functions that don't really do what they are supposed to do. So once again, what I'm saying is that in Python, you don't need to care about memory yourself. For example, in C++, we have 5 types of constructors, as far as I'm concerned, 5 types of constructors, because we need to allocate the memory properly. But in Python, we don't need to do that. The only thing that we need to do is just put all of the code that we need. So in our case, we just need to assign all of the variables. We need to call some functions. But once again, in C++, that code would be like memory allocation and so on. But destructor is not as useful in Python, and you will probably never see it in your code, because I personally have never seen a destructor in any of the code. I wrote it like many times, but I did not see it in any other piece of code, well, I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it, but it's very rare to see in Python code, because Python, once again, deallocates and allocates all the memory automatically. And that is why constructors and destructors are important. Once again, they're important, useful, you need to know about them. But you can omit them. So you can't omit init, of course, because you have some code that you always need to run. For example, customer, and you need some variables in here, or you need to call some functions whenever you create an object. So init is very, you see it very often, and yeah, it's like one of the most useful functions in object-oriented programming. But delete or destructor is not as important as constructor or initializer. And that is why I'm just saying that you need to know about destructor. So once again, destructor is a function that is being called whenever we delete our object. But in Python, you don't really delete your object, because the object is being deleted for you. What you can do with your destructor, however, is remove some of the like resources aside from your class. For example, if we open our file here, so file equals open, or self file equals open, then we can close that file whenever we delete our object. So yeah, that is one of the appliances for our destructor. And yeah, one of applications for our destructor. And yeah, that is the whole idea of constructors and destructors. So once again, I'm gonna repeat that the destructor is a function that is being called whenever we delete our object, but constructor, or in our case init, which is initializer, is being called whenever we delete our or whenever we create our object. So once again, destructor when we delete, constructor when we create. And constructor is being called with those parentheses. So you don't need to really call init like that. and never call init like that, because you just don't want to. I'll talk about that in the next video, but never do it like that. Okay, but now what do we have? We have, like, what do we have right now? We have our class customer, but do we really need those four variables? So do we really need those four variables? Or we can just remove them and just live with init. So can we remove our properties? So once again, those are called properties, or global variables for a class, if you would like me to call them like that. Can we just really remove them and just live with self and self ID equals something, name equals something, and so on? I would say yes, because once again, constructor is a function that is being called whenever we create our object. So that means that it doesn't matter if we put those variables here or if we don't. Constructor will always create them. So as you know, Python is a dynamic programming language, so I can do whatever I want. So for example, what I can do is use like something like, I don't know what to do, but like customer.new var equals 10. They can use that new var even though I did not create it in class. Yeah, as you can see, new var equals 10, or let me just put 20 or 2 right here. Let me run it. As you can see, 2. So that is the whole idea of Python dynamic programming language. Yeah, that was kind of strange, but okay. That is the whole idea of dynamic programming languages. And because of that, we can omit our properties. So we can omit putting our IDs here, putting our names here, and so on. And yeah, that is why we can just put them inside of init. But I have a question for you. So imagine that we have a simple class called number. So class called number. And inside of that number we have x, which is, for example, 0. But also what I have is init, which does not accept any variable, but it assigns x to 10. So if I would print number, so if I would create number object and print x, what will be the result? Actually, the result will be 10. And let me tell you why. So let me just run it. As you can see, 10 right here. So let me tell you why. The result will be 10 just because of the way our objects are created in Python. So once again, whenever we create an object, we call init. So what happens? What really happens? We create x as 0. Just before we start our object, or when we start our object, when we create our object, not start but create, we assign x to 0. But after that, when our init is called, x is being reassigned to 10. So that is why we would, if you have that situation, always go with the values you have in your init function. So that is the whole idea. And yeah, I think that's just it. So that video was about constructors and destructors in Python. I don't have anything else to say. I opened the TikTok, so you can subscribe to it. I have some videos on it. So yeah, they are related to programming, but they are really interesting and funny. So those videos are really like about code, but my videos on TikTok are more related to the fun ideas and to the interesting ideas in programming. Subscribe to my TikTok. You'll find a link in the description. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. My name is Andrew, and good luck.